Welcome back, everyone. After that really interesting conversation, our first session there, usually chaired by Jim, but really interesting contributions from everybody. I'm left with some great ideas, which I hope I will remember to factor in the final panel session later this morning. But now, our second presentation is A Play is What Survives of Theatre. This is a series of presentations on contemporary theatre practice. And the first one up will be, they are Pom Boyd, Shanna, Breen and Casserly, Noelle Brown, MALAPROP's Dylan Coburn Gray and Maeve O'Mahoney. And there'll also at the end be a reflection from Dr. Barry Houlihan. The first short presentation we're going to see is from Dylan Coburn Gray and Maeve O'Mahoney.
I'm Dylan Coburn Gray from MALAPROP.
Hi, I'm Maeve O'Mahoney from MALAPROP. MALAPROP is a collective of Dublin and London-based theatre artists, and we've been making work together for about 6 years.
6 years,
yeah.
Which feels a little spooky to say.
Yeah.
And about that many shows in that amount of time?
Yeah. And I guess to start off, it's worth saying that we don't have like a set structure to which we work or a set way that we collaborate. Kind of every show has its own journey, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes the work that we make is like extremely collaborative, and then other times, usually because of time frame issues, Dylan will take ideas and then go and write a full script, which is amazing that you can do that.
I mean, I think the line we've used in the past is that we have a set of priorities rather than a set theatrical language. I'm thinking the thing of ours you might have seen most recently is likely one of our digital works. So either Gulp, which was a short film commissioned by Project as part of their Future Forecasts program, or Epistles, which was the digital companion to our live show, Where Sat the Lovers. And I think because they're digital, some people might see those as outliers, but actually they sort of quite foregrounded the process we always go through, which is really, really collaborative. And then sometimes with script, I'll step in and it's sort of my job to enfold all of the conversations and ideas and offers that people have made in a frame that sort of makes sense of them. And then I suppose in the digital work, it's more often Claire who's taking that point role.
Yeah.
But I think what's common to every process is everybody weighing in pretty much all the time from the word go, is that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, very early meetings where we just throw loads of ideas at the wall, and then it usually turns into some kind of Google Doc, research doc, and yeah, everyone kind of chimes in.
On which I think probably can show you one.
Yeah.
So that's for Hot House, spoiler. So Gulp is this film which lives on the drive, but alongside it we sort of had all of our prompts and desktop business. This is a document in which everybody was jumping in. If I open the comment history here, you'll see chats going back and forth, mostly between me and Claire. Because I think that's where you see the editing process start to happen.
Yeah.
But this is a product from everybody. I think that's fair to say.
Lots of videos sent to Claire of like, here's 40 minutes of me browsing the internet.
And I think what I would say is one of the things about that process with everybody weighing in is you come up with way more stuff than you can use. So people might associate us with shows with trios of episodes in them. Something happens, something else happens, something related but sort of surprising and imagistic happens. That is a structure we use. And in a way it's sort of a model of the process too. So I think for every show, particularly ones in the longer time frame, there's generally been like 2 other complete versions of it that we tried out and then didn't follow through on.
Completely. I think as we get older, that's something that we value more and more. Like my 2 favorite shows that we've done are the 2 shows that have taken the longest and have these like early stage shows where it almost kind of feels like a fever dream to remember that there was a version of Everything Not Safe where we played ourselves and spoke directly to the audience. And even though that isn't at all representative of what we ended up with, there is kind of some bedding or some kind of like shadow of it in it, definitely.
And Hot House, I think, is one of those longer term shows.
Yeah,
is it? It was in the works for a long time and still hasn't been presented because it got COVIDed, but it's very well documented. in terms of, I suppose, how long that process was, and actually weirdly how much of early stage stuff made it through in some altered form to the finished product. Because this Google Doc here is interviews that me and you did in March of 2019.
I think so, yeah. It was the Extinction Rebellion like school, I guess, protest in Dublin, and we went out with our Zooms and we had a set of questions and we asked young people, what do you think Dublin will look like in 50 years? What are you most afraid of? Was there a moment where you kind of woke up to climate change, and was that connected to a specific image or a specific memory? And even though the show didn't end up being a verbatim show, we have kind of a sense, I think, of some of their ideas or some of their fears that ended up in the final finished script.
Because it's sort of interesting. I think at this point we thought Hot House was a verbatim karaoke musical, and then what we ended up with was very much not a verbatim karaoke musical. But it is interesting, sort of, I think, again, to see the way that, you know, collaborative practice weaves in and out of individual practice, because we didn't make a verbatim show, but you did make a verbatim show, sort of.
Yeah, in the process of making a verbatim show,
that features the voices of young people heavily. And then MALAPROP, I think, took that thought of youth or generationality and led it in a very different direction, which was about inheritance and, I suppose, being born into a situation you didn't choose and didn't determine.
And looking at the effects of climate through a generation of a family, I guess.
Yeah, actually. So we kept our sort of 3-episode structure, but we made them leapfrog through, I suppose, 3 generations of one family. And so that was a really early touch. Then after that, shortly afterwards, we had a really beautiful board from our in-house designer, Molly O'Kyan, with sort of some key phrases. Really interestingly, I look back at these and go, I could have written these down at some point, but I don't think I did. I think these are coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, maybe from Molly. I have no memory of this either.
But I think this one in particular resonates for us, because I think we had talked about Titanic as a really strong image. We sort of like that idea of thinking about the world almost as like a sinking ship. We all know where it's headed. But in the meantime, the band plays on. Just
try to enjoy it. Yeah.
And so there's all of this imagery around water. The show is called Hot House, but it ended up being about sort of cruise ships in a fairly major way. This is a research doc, I think, that came from you around the same time. And there was fantastic stuff about cruise ships here, which took us, I think, sort of from the past to the present.
Yeah, completely. I was reading a book at the time called The Water Will Come by Jeff Godell, and there was a chapter about climate tourism, I guess, or climate change tourism, about wealthy people who go on cruises to the Arctic to say goodbye to the icebergs, which I was just like, that's the best thing I've ever heard. Thank you for writing the show for us. And so we kind of became obsessed with that idea of like the indulgence of that, or the kind of, just that kind of idea of a cruise ship being a really fun place to set action as well. And Molly, our designer, kind of weirdly had loads of like really interesting tidbits about cruise ships that I think came from discussions that she'd had in a fringe.
Yeah. And cruise ships, I think, ended up sort of being the frame overall of the piece. The central episode was on one, but it was also sort of the dramaturgy, which was that like the show was couched almost as like a cabaret for bored rich people on board a ship.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of really interesting to see that transform over the process of this, you know, dialogue. Mm-hmm. And then it's interesting to look through the headings, I suppose, of other offers that you made, Maeve, from books and things that you were reading, and how many of them, they didn't all become the overall frame, but they did all end up somewhere. I think Miners and Florida Real Estate ended up being sort of little one-liners in the show. Alaska was part of the frame as well. Birds ended up having this sort of structural importance because we were using the extinction of birds species as sort of like a countdown to climate apocalypse, you know, which is birds over time going extinct faster and faster. And Exxon ended up being another little one-liner. So it's sort of interesting. They're all there in the finished show, just in some altered form. And then if we click through here, I sort of had some offers about sort of like showing versus telling. I sort of referenced a play from my individual practice. We were thinking in terms of samplers, you know, like little samples that start up, which help us move quickly through time. And then to a script outline, and you can sort of see some back and forth between me and Claire here, which again, I think is how you know that we're starting to assemble our ideas into a thing that makes sense of itself. And then We have a script from a post-Bristol development, which was the summer of
2019, I think. That was myself and Claire in Bristol working with some students that she would have worked with while doing her master's, which was also really interesting to have like non-Irish performers do a development of a script. That was really useful.
And to sort of remind us in a way that there was, even as it was a global story, sort of an Irish specificity to it.
Definitely, yeah.
I remember a really valuable piece of feedback from that being, we need to, I suppose, being about the framing of the early section, which is about a dysfunctional household, that we were like, we just don't think there's any men in this play. It doesn't work if there are men in this play. And we went, okay, let's embrace that. And then we had a script from the post-November development, which is here in Dublin. And again, chats between me and Claire here.
Yeah.
And then just to really quickly skip sideways, we have the Hot House with rehearsal edits from March 2020.
Yes.
Right as.
Yes. Yeah, and so it didn't happen, but hopefully it will at some stage. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. It might be nice to end on the swans.
Yeah, I really silly thought, which is, I suppose, just having talked you through that process. We have an image from the book All Yesterdays, which is, this is what I suppose someone imagining what it would look like if archaeologists in the future tried to imagine what swans look like based on their skeletons, and how wrong they would get it, because so much of what makes a swan is not in its skeleton. And I suppose thinking about the theme under which we've been asked to contribute, we do end up with scripts from our devising process, but the script is very much the skeleton in this sense, not just that it's the structure, but also that it's not the most important part of the story, because all of this other stuff is sort of where the ethos and the vision and the sensibility comes from.
Sometimes scripts aren't as spooky as they seem.
Yeah, and also they're not as scary. As an archaeologist, you know, sort of reviving your script in 50 years would be like, don't take that line so seriously. It's a really silly throwaway gag between me and Maeve and Claire.
Yeah.
So I feel that's us.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, what documentation remains after the show? You've had the last night party, you've done your get out, you've recovered from the hangover, and time has marched on. It's a very interesting question, and it's set me on quite an interesting little journey looking at the documentation that remains of some of my own work. So, Down Onto Blue was the first serious play I wrote. And I think what's interesting about the question that ITI have set us about what remains is what remains very much depends on where you started. So before I wrote Down Onto Blue, I was doing a lot of comedy and shows that were written on the hoof, and they'd be written in copybooks or whatever and performed possibly that week. And so it's interesting that when I set out to write a serious, proper play, it ended up in a serious, proper format and remains in that format as a manuscript. And, you know, then for a show like Shame that I made much later on and more recently, for me, I've surrounded myself here just for this with the props from Shame, which are so important to me and evoke so much in me, and they are part of the documentation to me. And also it exists in script form. And when I look at this script, it brings back all the memories, all the creativity and everything that went into the show. So it's a very colourful document, more so actually than this, which I think is interesting. And similarly with a comedy show like The Windy Lady, it literally exists in these cards. That is the show, and that's all I need, and that's all I needed to write, and it was just me doing it. So it would be quite difficult, I suppose, for somebody else to recreate that. So a lot of this question is around whether the show can be recreated again, and it's not just about what remains, but it's also about where it remains, it seems to me. And so a lot of my creative, or all of my creativity and documentation, remains in my home and therefore below the radar, I suppose. But it is massively important to me. And it's also, this is another example of something remaining that is of value to me. It's a radio play that I wrote for the BBC, and recently they archived it. And the guy who archived it sent me a copy of it. And I absolutely love this. I haven't even opened it, but that's how that play now exists in CD form. I don't even have a CD player on my computer. I can't play it, but it does exist in digital form on the archive. But it's interesting what that evokes me. So, for example, these scripts that I wrote for a play that was commissioned by the Abbey back in 2009, 2010, it exists, as a full. They were never produced. It was never produced, and it exists as The Garden in one version, and then it was also the Lithium. So there's two versions of it, and when I look at them, they're quite dry documents to me. They don't actually fill me, well, possibly because they were never produced, but also I know that when I wrote them, it was a very painstaking exercise, making sure that they were typed out properly and there was no spelling mistakes and all that. I felt like doing my homework. So there's no real joy or colour when I look at that documentation, and that tends to happen with the more serious play idea. For me, it feels less free, and when there's a freedom, and the documentation tends to represent that, and that there's so much colour in it, and it fills me with colour. But for somebody else, I don't know. For example, if somebody else wanted to produce Shame, well, I don't even know how I feel about that. But if they did, they probably would just be able to take the structure, because it's about an aspect of my life, so it wouldn't be of relevance. But they could certainly take the structure. So it's actually it's a really interesting question. What remains once you've done the show, and where it remains, and the value, I suppose, the value we give it to it. Like, for example, does this have more value than this, the script from Shane? Well, to me, no, but possibly for posterity, this will remain, and therefore, well, actually, that's kind of a horrifying thought, that is the only thing that will remain as representative of my work, because I don't feel it is fully representative. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Hello everyone, my name is Shanna and this is...
My name is Luke.
And we are an artistic duet who looks mainly at the environment and the climate crisis. And we are here today to talk to you about the provocation that a play is what survives of theatre, which is a beautiful thought. Yeah. And because mine and Luke's artworks or practices sort of bend and flex between many art forms, be it soundscapes, performance, we're really into land art at the moment. This is an interesting provocation because a play is never at the end of the work that we make. We are currently here in the Irish Theatre Institute, surrounded by many beautiful plays. You're currently being propped up by King Lear, but there's never a book at the end of our projects. So when we were discussing this morning about what survives, what's the residue of our work, we landed on something, that there is a legacy in our work. There is something that survives beyond the point of the live moment, and we're going to discuss that today.
Yeah.
Let's take it away, Luke.
So the first project we wanted to talk about was a project that we created in 2020 in the height of the pandemic called 1000 Miniature Meadows. And this was a soundscape performance which looked at Ireland's biodiversity decline. The project actually arrived to participants in the post and then invited them to step into nature close to their home, whether that was in their back garden or in their local park, and to take a listen to it. And as part of the project, we sent a small packet of Irish wildflower seeds to each participant, which I'm going to show you now. I'm just going to bring it a little bit closer. And at the end of the soundscape, each participant was then invited to plant their own wildflower meadow. So these meadows ended up in lots of different parts of Ireland, from Donegal to Cork to the Aran Islands to the Midlands. A network of wildflower meadows right across the island of Ireland.
Yeah, and it's really cool because we still receive emails. Well, I suppose this was the first summer where the meadows grew. So a lot of people got in touch from the project to send us photos of the meadows that they planted.
And how they progressed.
Really
cool.
So this sort of documentation of the event is continuing on, and we're excited to get more emails next summer about it as well.
Yeah.
And the next project we'd like to speak about is Mould into Shape, which happened the year before 1000 Miniature Meadows, which was another soundscape that was a travelling soundscape on board the Dart, the coastal train, and took participants from Pier Street Station in the city centre of Dublin to Killiney Beach, about 45 minutes away. And while the participant was on board the train, they had a headset and listened to a soundscape that explored our human and national connection to the material of plastic. And during the project, myself and Luke did a lot of beach cleans on Killiney Beach. And we retrieved a lot of plastic and archived it. And as the participants landed on Killiney Beach, they were met by stone mounds and invited to look in the stone mounds, where they found a small steel box. And in each box was a piece of this found plastic that we archived. Here is a little bottle top here, a River Rock or a Ballygown. So yeah, this was sort of the residue, or what was left behind of this work. Myself and Luke like to think that all around Dublin or Ireland are these steel boxes in people's homes. And they were invited to look after this item for the next 800 years, however long it will survive.
And then we also want to talk a little bit about our recent project called Root, which we made for the Dublin Theatre Festival this year. And Root was a performative inquiry which looked at the importance of trees in our ecosystem. And this was sparked by the fact that Ireland currently has the lowest tree cover in the EU at just 11%, and actually only 1% of that includes native Irish species. So as part of the work, we planted a microforest of 1,000 indigenous Irish trees in the centre of Ireland, which I'm just going to show you a photo of now. And we ended up documenting this planting process through photography. And I don't know if you can see in the photo, but these bamboos demarcate where the trees are in the ground. And this microforest ended up becoming almost like another character in the work outside of the room. It influenced and inspired a lot of the decisions that went into the final performance, which happened in a theatre for the audience. And I suppose it's really interesting as well because we travelled back there recently.
Yes.
And it was very beautiful to go back to the site and to see how the trees have grown since we initially planted them. They've almost doubled in size, I'd say.
Yeah, and we always imagine ourselves as elderly artists, and that we'll go back and visit this sort of forest, microforest at some stage of these oak. But that was sort of a rapid whistle-stop tour of the sort of what's left behind in our work. It is not King Lear, it is not a play, but there are these sort of objects or items or meadows or forests that will exist into the future and beyond the live moment of the artworks that we're creating.
The things that survive.
That propagation kind of brought it up for us, is what survives past the moment of live. And we'll continue thinking about it. And thank you very much for the invite.
Yes, thank you so much, Irish Theatre Institute, and it was lovely to be here with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hello, Noelle.
Hi, Catherine.
It's lovely to see you today. My name is Catherine Murphy. I am the playography editor and administrator here at Irish Theatre Institute. And for this kind of section of the documentation section of What is a Play, the Symposium, we decided to just have a bit of a chat with the fabulous, wonderful Noelle Brown. So Noelle, would you mind just giving a little bit of an introduction to yourself and your work?
Sure. I'm Noelle Brown. I'm an actor primarily, and then became a writer at the ripe old age of 47. And I'm also an adoption rights activist. And that's about it, really. Anything else you want me to say?
No, that's loads. Yeah. And I suppose the reason that we're kind of chatting here today is specifically about one play of yours, and it is a play called Postscript, which I think was first produced in 2013, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, as part of the Fringe, I think.
Correct, yeah, Fringe Festival.
Yeah. So I might, as opposed to waffling on about it myself, it's a beautiful play and really one of my favourites, but I might just read from the fabulous foreword that Katrina Crowe wrote for it this year, I think, actually.
Yeah.
And so she writes, I first saw Postscript in 2013 when it was a part of the Dublin Fringe Festival. Noelle, Michelle Forbes and Breen Naughton created a vivid, moving, beautifully constructed story of loss, search and partial resolution based on Noelle's own search for her birth mother, for whom she was taken 8 weeks after her birth in Bessborough and adopted. So I can't say it better than Katrina Crowe.
It goes on. She's incredible.
Yeah, it's really stunning. But I suppose what I want to chat with you about today specifically, because this is a conversation about documentation. And in essence, we're talking about a document here that is a play script that I have in front of me. But the entire show is about your search for your own documentation.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's not lost on me. I mean, that's what it is. It's a period of 12 years where I'm looking for, information about my birth, all the pieces of paper that we have as citizens, as Irish citizens, our birth certificates, our medical information, all of those things that are denied adopted people in Ireland. And that is still the case, sadly, in 2021, even though that play was written in 2013. It's still shockingly relevant. I also have the original script from, it's falling to bits, from the first rehearsal in August, September 2013. I take it out every time the play goes on. The last time was in the London Irish Centre in 2020. And I bring it with me. I'd be very, very, very upset if anything happened to it. And it's battered, but it's got everything in there, and
I'm sure it's got those jewels and notes and the changes, changes as it went along. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it. I mean, I think back to, like, when Michelle and I wrote this, I think back to later, this play and later plays, and I wouldn't have a hard copy of Foxy or Creaking. This one in particular is so special because it was the first time that I'd ever written anything, and I was lucky enough to work with Michelle on it. Last night I found, like, I would have a lot of notebooks as a writer. I've never gone away from handwriting, and particularly when I'm stuck in a play, I'll get a sheaf of paper and a pen, put the computer away and write. And I found a notebook that I'd forgotten about, which has all the original thoughts around when we were trying to originally write the first 20 minutes of the play. That's all we were trying to do. We didn't know that we'd actually have a full play in the end. So we went to write 20 minutes. And there's drawings in here of what I thought the set would look like, and just all the thoughts around it. And it's really incredible to go back over that and go, oh my God, this is where it started. Really, could you do me a favor there and just hold it up to the camera there, so I can see it? Like,
it's a very, very old, like it's a
lovely notebook though.
And it's funny because there's nothing else in there apart from Postscript. Just want to show you the little drawing, because when we did the first 20 minutes as an excerpt in the Theatre Machine Turns You On festival, in my mind, I was thinking, well, what would the set look like for this 20 minute showing of work? I was thinking, I want the little yellow dress, which is what I was wearing the day I was adopted, and I still have it. So I wanted that on a hanger with a little fan underneath it blowing. So I drew that.
Oh, wow.
And that's exactly what we did, for that 20-minute thing. We just had the little dress blowing, and then it was Kira Amelia actually did the set, and he had a little fan underneath, and the dress was just blowing.
And that's so within the writing then as well, so that it's also interconnected in that way. And a yellow dress is such a potent, symbol, and such a so vibrant, and yet that day was what the day was.
Yeah, and that's where the idea, I think, that sort of took root in my head, though I didn't ever think I was going to write a play, was in a workshop with Ruth Little, where she asked us to bring in an object. It was during the next stage that meant something to us, and I brought in the dress, and I said, this I was wearing this today I was adopted, and she was like, and I suppose that the idea must have been in my head to write something, though it wasn't until late 2012 that we started to think about doing something, but I love having these pieces of paper, like, part of the set is a litter of letters scattered across the stage. It's all about paper, tangible documentation, you can't replace that. If someone sent me a screenshot of my birth certificate, it's not the same as going in and getting your birth certificate. And I've done that, my original birth certificate. The documentation is very important to me. The physical copy of something is really important. And I think that comes from being an actor, having had scripts in my hand over the years. I don't personally wouldn't walk around rehearsal room with the laptop and, be blocking a show or whatever. I'd have to have the paper. But that's, as I went on, as I said, I don't really have copies of Foxy or Creaking, but this, I'd always have to have a hard copy of it somewhere. It's really important to me.
And it makes sense. It makes sense for the story that it is, that like the hard copy is where the story lives, and it's where,
And it has evolved a little bit, and when I go back and look at it, I go, the odd time I'll take it out. Like the words are in my bones now, but if I've done it so many times, I'll go back and have a reason. I go, oh God, did I used to say that? Yeah, all right. Oh, so I say it like that now. So there has been changes, I suppose, as well.
Which is only natural, sure. Especially over, I think we were saying there just before we came on, the last time it was performed was in the London Irish Centre in 2020, start of 2020, obviously.
Yeah.
And can I ask, Noelle, just about how, in terms of your activism and the show, because in terms of your work as an activist, it is the documentation of the history of the nation, a sullied and awful history, certainly, but it is that as well. And how do you find that marrying of kind of art and activism?
It's funny. I suppose I realized a couple of years ago that my first step into activism was writing that play. I didn't know it at the time. And for me now in 2021, the play is, yes, it's a piece of theatre, it's a piece of art, but primarily it's a piece of activism because of the reactions it gets, because of the conversations I've had, the thousands upon thousands of people that I've met, birth mothers, adopted people, all of those conversations, all of those post-show discussions, everything. For me, it's more about activism than anything else. And it feels different on stage doing it. Every time we do it after a gap or whatever, there's a different kind of listening. People will react in a certain way. And we start in 2013, people didn't really know how bad things were. The fight hadn't emerged or gone to the place it is now. We had no commission investigation report. Tume story hadn't broke either in 2013 or 2014. I think that story broke. So we're speaking to a very aware audience now, and it's different. Before London, we did it in the Peacock. And there was a young audience. There were so many young people, children of women who were born in mother and baby homes. And I met them afterwards, and they're really angry. So for me, this document is a piece of activism. The play is a piece of activism. And I think that's where it's at its most effective. It is art as well. And the powerful platform that art gives when you have something that you want to say around, a piece of activism or make some changes in society. So that's what it is for me, I think, primarily.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I don't think we can end on a better note than that, as art as activism and playwriting as activism. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, and everybody go and buy the e-play.
Thank you, Lily.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Barry Houlihan. It's my great pleasure to be able to respond to all panelists this morning who've all given such personal and fascinating responses on the provocation and on the question about what survives the theatre. From various documents, the various processes of all these artists and theatre makers, from Noelle's notebooks to shared online Google Docs used by MALAPROP, all evidence of the work, the collaborators, and of the plays that have survived. And as Dylan and Maeve have said, each play has its own journey into some life of survival beyond the play. And what is perhaps a place to begin reflecting on this provocation about what survives the theatre is the idea of survival itself and of perseverance, be that in response to the themes raised this morning, such as climate change and the environment, institutional histories of Ireland's past and indeed present, or the journey into our own increasingly digital futures. What play will survive? What form of play will survive? And that determines what records and what archive will exist. And again, an archive as beginning is perhaps the wrong place to start, because it is an endpoint. It becomes a place of repository where memory is collected, shared, and made accessible. It survives. So to document theatre and performance itself, to somehow capture all that liveness, is like running to catch up with yourself. You may not get very far. And if a further common theme from all this morning's panelists is about resistance, we see the power of theatre as a form of protest in itself, the activist power of the play and its agency to enable an audience to experience or to listen, or to offer an audience a choice about the future. Documents too then are a form of activism. They offer resistance to forgetfulness, a protest against neglect. At the New York Public Library, in the center of Manhattan, sits the archive of Lady Augusta Gregory. And in the manuscript of the play Kathleen the Houlihan, which she co-wrote, she wrote across the page of that script these 4 words: all this, mine alone. And in writing those few words, signaling to future readers who would find her archive presence, Gregory took authority about the play. She took ownership of her own theatrical labour and recognition that would be denied to her so often later on. And Pom Boyd made similar really powerful points on this about the archival record. It's not perfect. The archive isn't complete. And it also has its own privileges. Those whose work is accepted or somehow deemed official or more official than others. What work is recorded? What work is published? What work gets reviewed? All these are signs of the life of the play beyond its initial existence. Why do some plays survive more than others? So what survives the play then helps us to make visible the work of others who have been neglected or marginalized within Irish society. We'll think about the work of women playwrights who have not been seen or produced. We think about the characters and the voices who have also been marginalized on the stage and in Irish society beyond the theatre. Those who have been rendered invisible by the mechanisms of the state, those who are disabled, queer, travellers, carers, migrants, and others who in society struggle to find a place to be heard and recognised, but yet can do so in the theatre. That work needs to be documented, but it needs to be created first, and it needs to be supported, it needs to be remembered, and it needs to be accessible. We can't have a national memory if we can't see and recognise all of those who are in our society. So as an archivist of the theatre, I'm constantly living in the past liveness of performance, and from reconstructing and putting back together the pieces of our theatre heritage and digitising records of a play, digitising the records of a live performance, I've been able to witness and maybe re-witness some great moments in Ireland's theatre history. I've been able to watch in awe at Donald McCann as Frank Hardy in Friel's Faith Healer, at the storytelling of Siobhan McKenna as Momo in Tom Murphy's Ballygongora, or more recently, and much more recently, been able to witness Panti Bliss's speech at the Abbey as part of the Noble Call series in 2014. And the refrain in Panti's remarkable speech that night, "That feels oppressive," was heard globally through news feeds and through coverage after the speech. And it had an undoubted contribution to the marriage equality campaign of that year. And that speech and those words, "that feels oppressive," may yet prove to be some of the most powerful words ever spoken in our national theatre. But it wasn't a play. But does that matter? But yet it reminds us that how theatre responds and makes connections from the personal and the private experiences, and how theatre helps us to find our own way into each other's stories. That speech about the experience of homophobia in Ireland, be it spoken from the perspective of Panti Bliss or by Rory O'Neill, or both, is still a reminder of what survives the theatre and how society listens. Shanna and Luke talked about the lasting presence of their work and the physical legacy of human impact on the environment around us, with archives plastic washed up on beaches given to audience members as a piece of theatrical residue from the work, and perhaps which is still likely in people's homes today. When leaving a performance of Anu Productions Laundry some years ago, I was handed a bar of carbolic soap wrapped in brown paper and string with a label with my name on it. And the smell of that soap flooded out every time I opened the drawer I kept it in. And yet that object, the soap from laundry, has gotten lost over the years, and I regret it still. It was a constant reminder of the power of memory, of what survives the women of Sean McDermott Street and of the other Magdalen laundries around the country, but also what survives the play. So points made by all in this session this morning have been so important to listen to and to take so much away from. Again, as Luke and Shanna mentioned, a play is never at the end of what we make. And again, it echoes Noelle's point about her own work and her process, about the words are in my bones now. So what survives the play is also the playmakers and the audiences who embody the process. So like issues that affects all of us in our society and our environment, the play also needs to be sustainable. Its records need to be made sustainable. And as a place of work, discovery and creation, the theatre needs to be kept sustainable, or else we won't have plays and work to document. If a play is what survives the theatre, then what survives the play? So Samuel Beckett said in an interview in 1961 that to find a form that accommodates the mess, that is the task of the artist now. And accommodating the mess is perhaps the best description of a theatre archive. It is messy and it is a chaotic process. I'm surrounded by it here today, amongst the mess, amongst the records and amongst the voices and stories of our theatre makers at the theatre archives here at NUI Galway. Finding a form, as Beckett said, is about helping a play survive, to locate it somewhere between performance, archive and memory. The Theatre Archive is a national archive and it comprises a social history of Ireland. It reminds us who we were, whose stories we chose to listen to, or what we spoke out against. Today, within the records of our plays, our artists and our audiences, these memory spaces take on the form of a performance in their own right as part of our theatre of memory. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry. That was really, really interesting. And it is timely for us to think about and talk for the future around memory and the theatre of memory and our memories of theatre and how we're capturing that. And we in Irish Theatre Institute are have lots of conversations with NUIG and with Barry on archiving, and that geography is not an archive, it's an online catalogue and a database, and how we might all work together to kind of crystallise and capture what is Irish theatre. So now we're going to have a break. So do come back to us at 11:50 for our final panel of this symposium, which is It Was a Show of No Words, a Play Script Exists. See you all then. Thank you.